The restaurant was quiet, the hum of the air conditioner barely noticeable as a woman in a simple white dress stepped through the door. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floor, and she paused, scanning the room as the host, an eager young man, barely out of his 20s, lifted his head from his phone. She approached the counter, her expression calm, yet there was a tension in the air that was impossible to ignore. "Table for one?" the host asked, his voice a little too polite, a little too rehearsed. "Yes, please," she replied softly, giving him a faint smile. Without a word, the host glanced at her, a quick once-over that lingered on her face a fraction longer than necessary. He hesitated, his gaze shifting between the dining area and her. The smile faltered on her lips as she watched his discomfort grow. "I'm afraid we're full at the moment," he said after a beat, his voice changing slightly, becoming colder. "Maybe another time." The woman blinked, confusion flickering in her eyes. She had been here before, many times, in fact, and the restaurant had always been known for its hospitality. The words didn't sit right with her. "I'm sorry, what do you mean?" "I see there are open tables," she asked, trying to keep her tone even, her voice controlled despite the hint of rising frustration. The host shifted on his feet. "We don't have any available seating at this moment," he repeated, more firmly this time. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck rise. There was something in his tone, something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the words, it was his body language, the way he avoided her eyes, the subtle shift in his posture. "I don't understand," she said, her voice now more assertive. "You're telling me there's no available table at all?" The host gave a small, apologetic smile, his eyes flickering nervously to the manager, who was standing near the kitchen. "I'm afraid so." "It's policy," he said quickly, clearly wanting to end the conversation. She stared at him for a moment, trying to make sense of the situation, her mind running through possibilities. Something was wrong. She had been a loyal customer for years, a regular who had built a rapport with the staff. This wasn't just an oversight. Without another word, she turned, her gaze now fixed on the manager as she walked toward him. He stood near the bar, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with mild interest. His face was neutral, though a flicker of recognition passed through his eyes when he saw her approach. "Excuse me, I need to speak with you," she said, her voice calm but firm. The manager raised an eyebrow but said nothing as she stopped in front of him. She could feel the weight of his gaze, but she stood her ground, locking eyes with him. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone detached, professional, almost too professional. "I was just told that there are no available tables, despite the fact that I see empty ones," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "I'd like to know why that is." The manager's expression faltered for a second. "I'm afraid we have a policy for walk-ins." "It's to ensure fairness," he explained, but there was an undertone in his voice, a defensive edge that didn't belong in a simple explanation. She studied his face for a long moment before speaking again. "I've dined here many times. I know your policy. This isn't about seating, this is about something else." The manager opened his mouth to respond, but she cut him off. "I don't appreciate being turned away like this." "Not after I've been coming here regularly," she said, her voice growing colder. "You didn't even give me a chance to explain. You judged me the moment I walked in." The manager's eyes widened slightly, and he hesitated before speaking, his words caught between defensiveness and something else, something she couldn't quite identify. "I'm sorry if you feel that way," he said, but it sounded hollow, like he wasn't truly apologizing. She took a deep breath, stepping back slightly. She had seen that look before, the subtle discomfort that some people had when confronted with someone like her. Black, successful, and out of place in a world that often didn't know how to deal with her presence. "I'm the owner," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. There was a long pause. The manager blinked, then blinked again, his eyes flicking up and down as he processed what she had just said. His face turned pale, and his mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence stretched on, and she watched him closely. He had no idea who she was, of course. He hadn't seen her name on the reservation list. He hadn't recognized her face, or perhaps he had, and had assumed her presence here meant she wasn't a person worth giving proper service to. His face flushed, and he finally found his voice. I'm so sorry, he stammered, his confidence now gone, replaced by an awkward apology that didn't come close to fixing what had been done. You should be, she replied coldly, her gaze unwavering. I've been in this industry for years. I've worked hard to build my reputation, and you, she paused, shaking her head, you just made assumptions based on my appearance. The manager opened his mouth to protest, but she didn't give him the chance. I'm not asking for your pity, she said, her tone hardening. I'm asking for respect. What I get from you is bias. And that's something I'm not willing to accept, not from my own staff. The tension hung in the air like a thick fog, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The manager seemed to shrink in front of her, his posture deflated as if the weight of his actions had finally hit him. She turned, walking toward the door. Before leaving, she paused, looking over her shoulder. I expect this to be fixed by tomorrow, she said firmly. And I expect an apology, not just from you, but from the host who treated me like I didn't belong here. She walked out, the door closing softly behind her. The restaurant was silent again, but there was a palpable change in the air. The manager stood frozen, staring at the door where the woman had just exited. He could feel the weight of his mistake now, heavy and undeniable. And in the back of his mind, a question echoed, how often had he made those assumptions without realizing it? But it wasn't until later, when the woman called him to arrange a meeting, that he realized the true power of the moment. It wasn't about fixing a seating issue or making amends for a single incident, it was about addressing a larger, deeper issue that ran through the entire industry. And for the first time, he began to question how much he had overlooked. She, however, had already moved past it. For her, it wasn't just a fight for respect, it was a fight for fairness. And fairness was something she'd been seeking her entire life, in a world that was often more interested in fitting people into neat little boxes than seeing them for who they truly were. The days that followed were filled with phone calls, meetings, and reflections. The manager, in an attempt to salvage what little dignity he had left, reached out to her with an apology. But she had already made up her mind. Her response was measured but firm, an apology wouldn't suffice. Not this time. When the meeting finally came, the manager stood nervously in the lobby of her office. He wasn't sure how to approach the situation, how to explain himself in a way that wouldn't seem forced or insincere. His thoughts raced, but nothing felt like it could undo the damage that had been done. She walked into the room, her presence filling the space. She was confident, poised, everything the manager now wished he had been when they first met. There was a fire in her eyes, a quiet but undeniable strength that commanded respect. Thank you for meeting with me, she began, her voice calm but carrying an edge. But let's be clear, this isn't just about a single instance. It's about a system, a culture, that allows these things to happen regularly without any consequence. The manager opened his mouth to respond, but she held up a hand, silencing him. She wasn't here to listen to excuses, to hear him explain himself. She was here to make him understand that the problem went far beyond his own actions. That night, what you did was just the surface, she continued. But it's not just you. It's every person who looks at someone like me and sees only the color of my skin. It's every time someone's judgment is clouded by bias, and we, as a society, let it slide because it's easier to pretend it doesn't exist. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes lowering as if he couldn't quite face the weight of her words. I've spent my entire career fighting against those assumptions, she said, her voice tight with emotion. Every time someone doubts my capabilities because of my race, because of my gender, I fight back. But you made me feel small. And I'm not the only one you've done this to. This behavior, it's systemic. And I've been complicit, sitting in my privilege, pretending that this isn't my problem. The silence in the room was thick, punctuated only by the sound of the manager's shallow breaths. He didn't know how to respond, how to explain the internal struggle that was unfolding within him. Part of him wanted to apologize, again, beg for forgiveness. But that wasn't what she needed. She needed change. I've been in this industry long enough to know that we can do better, she continued, her tone hardening. But to do better, we need to look deeper. We need to confront these uncomfortable truths head-on. She paused, allowing the gravity of her words to settle. You have a choice, she said finally. You can apologize and move on, or you can learn. You can take responsibility for your actions and use this as an opportunity to make real, lasting change. The manager didn't say anything for a long moment. He couldn't. The weight of his actions, his assumptions, had hit him in a way he hadn't expected. He wasn't just ashamed, he was angry with himself, with the system that had allowed him to think the way he had. How do I start? He asked, his voice small. Her eyes softened, just a little. She wasn't expecting him to have all the answers, but she needed to know that he was willing to find them. You start by listening. By acknowledging that this doesn't just affect me, it affects everyone, she said. And then, you act. You make sure that this doesn't happen again. Not in your restaurant, not in your life. And you make sure that anyone who walks through your doors knows that they matter, no matter what they look like, where they come from, or what their story is. The manager nodded slowly, a mixture of guilt and resolve washing over him. He could feel the shift within him, the desire to make things right, but he also knew that he had a long way to go. As the meeting came to an end, the woman stood, offering him a small, professional smile. I'm glad you're willing to learn, she said. But don't mistake this for forgiveness. That's something that's earned. And with that, she walked out, leaving the manager to confront the reality of what had just transpired. He didn't leave the office immediately. Instead, he sat there, staring at the empty chair across from him, his mind processing everything she had said. She wasn't angry, not in the way he expected. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was asking for change. And for the first time, he truly saw what she meant. The next day, he began making calls. Calls to staff members, to his peers, to organizations that could help educate him on diversity and inclusion. He enrolled in training programs and even scheduled a meeting with the woman again, this time to discuss actionable steps for creating a more inclusive environment at the restaurant. Weeks passed, and things began to change, not just in the restaurant, but in the manager himself. His conversations with the staff became more intentional, focused on understanding bias and dismantling stereotypes. Slowly, he saw a shift, not just in his approach to the business, but in his own worldview. He realized how deeply ingrained some of the prejudices were, and he was committed to unlearning them. Meanwhile, the woman continued to thrive in her business. She expanded her efforts beyond just her restaurant, using her platform to raise awareness about systemic racism and inequality in the hospitality industry. She worked with others who shared her vision, supporting initiatives that promoted diversity, equity, and inclusion. Months later, the manager approached her again, this time not with an apology, but with an offer, a partnership. He wanted to work with her on creating a mentorship program for other restaurant owners and managers, to ensure that the lessons he had learned wouldn't be confined to his own experience. He wanted to share it, to make a broader impact. She accepted, not because she believed he had redeemed himself, but because she knew that true change came from collaboration, from finding common ground and building bridges. And in that moment, she realized that her fight had sparked something bigger than she could have imagined, a ripple effect of change that was just beginning. The restaurant manager, once a man blinded by assumptions, had become part of the solution, committed to ensuring that the mistakes of the past would never be repeated. And though his journey had just begun, he knew that the hardest part was over, the part where he truly saw the world through a different lens. As the partnership between the restaurant manager and the woman grew, so did their shared vision for a more inclusive industry. Their work together wasn't just a personal project, it was a movement. The program they launched, aimed at fostering diversity in hospitality, gained traction quickly. They held workshops, training sessions, and created resources for restaurant owners and employees to confront their biases and understand the significance of representation in every aspect of their business, from hiring practices to customer service. The woman, now a known advocate for equality in business, found herself juggling her role as an owner with her growing responsibilities as a mentor and community leader. She was frequently invited to speak at conferences, her story of perseverance and triumph inspiring countless others. Her impact rippled out far beyond the walls of her restaurant. But it was never just about the accolades, it was always about creating space for others to stand where she stood. One day, as she sat in her office, going over some of the progress reports from the mentorship program, she received an unexpected phone call. It was from a major chain restaurant, one of the largest in the country, wanting to discuss an initiative focused on integrating more diverse talent into leadership positions within the company. The conversation was brief but impactful. The chain's executives had been following her work and were interested in partnering with her to build a training program for their own staff, one that focused not only on diversity but on equitable career advancement. They wanted her expertise, her experience, and her perspective to guide their new initiative. The call was a validation of everything she had been fighting for, but she didn't take it lightly. She knew that this opportunity came with its own challenges. It wasn't enough to simply partner with a large corporation, the real test would be ensuring that the changes they implemented were meaningful and long-lasting, not just surface-level changes to boost public relations. She wanted real progress, not just tokenism. Over the following months, she worked closely with the chain, helping them revamp their leadership development programs to include mentorship for people of color and underrepresented groups, addressing unconscious bias at all levels, and ensuring that hiring and promotion practices were transparent and equitable. She even made sure that their training programs weren't just for show. They were followed up with accountability measures to track progress and outcomes. The partnership garnered media attention, and soon other corporations, large and small, began reaching out to her for guidance. It was a turning point in her journey, one she hadn't fully expected but welcomed with open arms. She was no longer just the owner of a restaurant. She had become a trailblazer, a thought leader in an industry that desperately needed change. But as her influence grew, so did the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders. She began to notice the toll it was taking on her personal life, the constant balancing act between the demands of her business and her commitment to systemic change. Long hours, endless meetings, and the pressure of being a visible symbol of progress, she was stretched thin. One evening, after a particularly grueling week, she sat in her office, staring out at the city skyline, her phone buzzing incessantly with messages and emails. It was moments like these that made her question if she had the strength to continue on this path. The fatigue was real, and the emotional exhaustion even more so. But then she thought about the young girl she had been, the girl who once sat at a table, doubted by everyone around her. She thought about the countless others who had been turned away, unheard, unseen. And in that moment, she realized that this wasn't just her fight anymore, it was the fight of everyone who had ever been marginalized, overlooked, or underestimated. With that realization, she knew that she couldn't stop, not now, not when so much was at stake. Meanwhile, the restaurant manager continued his own journey of self-reflection and growth. The mentorship program had transformed him, just as it had transformed his restaurant. He had learned how to hold difficult conversations, how to challenge his own assumptions, and how to truly make a difference in the lives of those who worked for him. He no longer saw his staff as a group to be managed but as individuals who needed support, guidance, and opportunity. He became a vocal advocate for diversity and inclusion, using his platform to speak out against discrimination within the industry. He even helped implement initiatives to make restaurant kitchens more accessible to people with disabilities, ensuring that everyone, regardless of their background or abilities, had a fair shot at succeeding in the industry. But even as he made strides, he knew that the work wasn't over. He understood that real change required constant vigilance, a willingness to evolve, and the courage to speak up when it mattered most. He found himself frequently revisiting the lessons the woman had taught him, the lessons about listening, about seeing people for who they truly were, and about the necessity of creating spaces where everyone could thrive. And as the years passed, their work together began to have an even more profound impact. The restaurant industry, once resistant to change, began to slowly but surely reflect the diversity of the communities it served. It wasn't perfect. There were still challenges, still struggles against long-held biases, but the conversation had shifted. More people were talking about it, more people were taking action. The woman, looking back at how far she had come, realized that change hadn't happened overnight. It had taken countless conversations, difficult decisions, and moments of doubt. But in the end, she had made a difference. And she wasn't done yet. There would always be more work to do, more tables to turn, more systems to dismantle, more people to lift up. But she was no longer alone in this fight. She had sparked something that had spread far beyond her own restaurant, something that would continue to grow and evolve for years to come. And as she sat in her office one evening, reflecting on everything they had accomplished, she smiled softly to herself. This was only the beginning. The woman leaned back in her chair, the weight of everything she had built settling on her shoulders like a comforting blanket. She had come a long way from that night in her restaurant, when a simple assumption had sparked a revolution. The program they had launched together had become the cornerstone of a new era in the hospitality industry, one where bias was no longer hidden under the surface but confronted head-on. Despite the long hours, despite the sacrifices, she felt a sense of fulfillment. But that fulfillment wasn't born from personal achievement. It came from the ripple effect she had created, the stories of employees who had found mentors who looked like them, the countless people who had been given opportunities they would have otherwise never received, and the owners and managers who had shifted their entire perspective on what it meant to lead inclusively. The phone buzzed once more, and she picked it up absent-mindedly. It was another meeting request, this time from an international chain seeking to bring their own teams into the fold. It wasn't just the restaurants anymore. It was global. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to smile. It was overwhelming, but this was the kind of change she had always hoped for, change that extended beyond the walls of her own business, beyond her own world. The next generation of restaurant owners and leaders would have the tools to succeed without facing the barriers that had once stood in her way. The work was never truly over, but the foundation had been laid. And yet, as the call continued, a part of her knew that this wasn't the end of the journey. This wasn't the pinnacle. There would always be more to do, more to fight for, more people who needed her voice to be heard. But there was peace in that knowledge. The world she had hoped to see. A world where race, gender, and background didn't define someone's worth, was slowly but surely becoming more tangible. It was within reach. A few days later, she returned to the restaurant. It was quiet, the afternoon lull that always seemed to bring a sense of stillness to the space. She walked through the dining room, taking in the polished tables, the artwork that adorned the walls. Artwork that now represented not just the beauty of the food but the culture, the diversity, and the history behind it. The manager, now a trusted partner, came up to her as she walked toward the kitchen. His face lit up when he saw her, and for a brief moment, she saw the man he had become, not just a manager, but someone who understood the weight of what they had done together. "I was thinking," he said, his voice hesitant but steady. "Maybe we could start a new initiative. Something that highlights stories from our staff. Their backgrounds, their journeys. Let's make sure that people who dine here understand the people who make it happen." She paused, considering his idea. The woman had learned over time that leadership was about empowering others, and this was exactly that. It wasn't just about changing policies or making external statements, it was about giving people the space to share their truths, to be seen and heard for who they were. Let's do it, she said with a nod. Let's put the spotlight on the ones who've always been in the background. Let's tell their stories. And so, they did. They created a new initiative, a monthly feature on the restaurant's menu, spotlighting the stories of different staff members. Their achievements, their struggles, their dreams. The customers loved it. They appreciated the faces behind the food, and the restaurant became not just a place to eat, but a place of connection. As months passed, the woman's life shifted again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't the frantic pace of building something new or battling against the injustices she once faced. It was the steady rhythm of change settling in, of a foundation that had been solidified. Her restaurant thrived, not just because of its food, but because it became a symbol, of resilience, of understanding, of community. And as the world continued to shift, so did the industry she had once fought so hard to change. The restaurant business had evolved into something greater, more inclusive, more reflective of the society it served. One day, sitting in her office overlooking the bustling city streets, she realized that this journey had been about so much more than she had originally imagined. It wasn't just about making a place for herself in a world that had been hostile. It was about creating a space for everyone who had ever felt overlooked, unheard, or dismissed. The phone rang again. It was another opportunity, another chance to push the boundaries, to create more change. But this time, when she picked up the phone, it wasn't the weight of a single voice she carried. It was the weight of a movement, one that had grown into something far bigger than herself. And with a sense of finality, she answered. Let's make it happen. The journey was never over, but it had come full circle. She had fought for a seat at the table, and now she was leading it, along with others who had once been denied the same privilege.